Hello, my name's Kat Horton. I'm an autism professional. I've been working with kids with autism for 10 years now. So I've worked with over 800 families over the past 10 years, and most of that has been one-on-one, either working directly with the child in the playroom or working with parents, coaching parents on how to interact with their children in a way that accelerates their social and emotional and cognitive development. I've also for the past 3 years been involved in doctoral level research with Lancaster University in the UK, looking specifically at autism interventions and how we can most effectively help these children who have autism or related developmental diagnoses. So when I say I've been working with children with autism for 10 years, really I mean that I've been playing. I have been running, jumping, singing, reading, skipping, painting, sculpting, playing with children with autism, because what I found and what a lot of researchers are now realizing is that the best way to help children to develop the sort of social and communication skills that we want to see is through play, is through things that the child is inherently interested in. So for some children that means talking about dinosaurs. For other children it means running as fast as they can and crashing into a mat at the end of the room. For other children it means playing tickles or blowing bubbles or getting covered in paint and painting the walls. Other children like to make up stories. Some children like to go on adventures and imaginary play and go to the moon. Every child has their own interest. But what we find is that when I can get a child engaged in some kind of activity for that child that is really, really fascinating, that's when we get, firstly, the deepest levels of connection, and children easily engage in the reciprocal back and forth interaction. And it's from those moments that we get the most learning. Those are our most valuable teaching moments. So certainly one of the most important things I've learned from that process is that children learn, all children, and especially children with autism, learn the most through social interaction, through getting engaged with another person. So all of our methods that we use that relate to autism are based on that idea. And so what we do is we train parents to be able to get their children involved in those kind of interactions. And most importantly, to be able to extend and expand those interactions. So if you're the parent of a child with autism, you already know how to get your child hooked into one of those interactions. You already know at least one thing that your child lights up with. That he starts looking at you or smiling or gets glued to your face. Those are the kind of moments we're looking for. Those are our teaching moments. So I'm sure for all of you there's at least one thing that you can do with your child that you know is going to get that kind of response, or going to get that intensity of focus from your child. So what we do then is help you to firstly create those moments more often during your day, so you can get your child connected in social interaction more often. And then we help you learn how to extend that over time so that those exchanges become longer and longer. And then how do you expand that? So you can't play tickles forever. Your child isn't going to learn everything he needs to know through tickles or chase if you play the same thing over and over. But so what we do is we'll help you expand that so that you can start to move from one or a limited range of games your child might be interested in, and you start to broaden that so that your child becomes firstly interested in many other games and many other topics, but also through that then learns all the other things that you want to teach. And it might be that you start by teaching more sort of social and communication skills, and then maybe move on to teaching more academic or cognitive skills. But before we get to what it is that you want to teach your children, I'm sure there's all sorts of things that you would love for your children to learn. Before we get to that, it's important that we look at how. How are you teaching? What is your style of interaction as you relate to your child and you look for those moments of engagement, those moments when your child is most motivated and really ready and available to learn. In order to get to that place, often parents have to adapt their style of interaction in a way that works for the child, so that you can create more and more of those learning moments, and you can expand the time that your child spends engaged in those kind of learning activities with you. So there's a lot of research that's been coming out recently looking at how parents interact with their children, and specifically how parents interact with a child who has autism or some kind of developmental delay. And what we're finding is that there's a whole range, a whole spectrum of how parents interact with their children. So at one end of the spectrum, there's a style of interaction that's very directive. So this might be where the adult is asking a lot of questions of the child, or making a lot of demands, trying to redirect the child to another activity, telling them, stop doing this, we have to go over here and do this, this is better. Redirecting, directing the activity a lot. So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have a very passive style of interaction, where the adult is not leading at all, where they're allowing the child to lead the most. And they're not asking any questions, not making any demands. This is very rare in a parent-child dyad, very rare. Usually there's something more at the other end, where they're more directive. Now in the middle of those two extremes, there's something that we call a responsive style of interaction. And what this is where the parent is allowing the child to be an equal partner in this relationship. So if you think about any relationship in your life, you'll find that if there's two people interacting, there's always this balance between somebody who's more directive and leading more of the conversation, and there'll be always someone who's a bit more passive and doing more following. Now sometimes you get an interaction that's very balanced, and there's sort of a 50-50 balance between the two partners in the conversation. But often you'll find that there's more of a sway to one side, and one side is more passive. And it's not a personality thing often. Often it will depend on who you're interacting with. So if you tend to be a person who is more passive, say, you tend to allow the other person to lead, and you tend to follow more in a conversation, you might find yourself, if you're talking to someone who's even more passive, that you take on the more directive role. So we change ourselves to balance with our partner, and we do that intuitively without even thinking about it. That's part of what we learned as we were developing socially. So that balance, that play is always happening in any interaction. But what we find with children who are diagnosed with autism or some kind of developmental delay is that these children tend to be less strong at initiating and taking the lead in social interactions. Now they may be very strong at taking the lead in directing their own activities, and your child might have particular activities that he or she is really good at going off and taking the lead and doing on his or her own, but not necessarily in an interactive way. So often we find that children with autism can be very good or fairly good at responding to the initiations of others. So if you ask a question or you make a comment, you might get a response back from your child. But often what we find is that if you sit back and you take a very passive style, that your children find it very hard to initiate. So it's very hard for them to start the interaction with you. And this doesn't matter whether your child is verbal and uses language, or non-verbal, pre-verbal, and doesn't use language. There's still lots of non-verbal ways in which you can initiate contact. So a typical child who is pre-verbal will come up and give you an object, or show you something, or come up and touch you, or use a gesture as a way to initiate an interaction. Children with autism often don't do that. And you might be surprised actually if you go home and you really intentionally take a very passive style of interaction, and you don't initiate with your child, but really you just sit back and observe. You might be surprised at how little your child might initiate with you without you prompting them in some way. So this is actually, the researchers are finding that there's actually two different brain circuits that are responsible for, one is responsible for our responses to other people's social initiations, and the other brain circuit is responsible for us initiating social initiations. And these are two separate skills, And it's often the latter, the ability to initiate, that we need to really work on with children who are diagnosed with autism. And there's lots of fun ways we can do that. But the first essential piece is that we, as the adults, as the partners of, social partners of these children, is that we take a style of interaction that allows for a balance in the back and forth, allows for, yes, us to initiate some of the time, but also for our children to initiate and to get more practice at initiating. We want to inspire our children to make social initiations towards other people. So if we take a very directive style where we're always guiding and prompting and moving things along, we don't give our children a chance to do that. So one of the most important things that we do is to help parents to take on a responsive style of interaction. So this is not at the passive end of the spectrum, and it's not at the directive end. It's sort of in the middle. And really what you're going to do is you're going to really follow your child's interests. You're going to expand and build on your child's interests rather than trying to redirect. You're going to add comments and add pieces of information to what's going on rather than make requests or make demands. And also we're going to teach you how to synchronize your timing with your child. Often it comes down to a very simple lack of synchronization between the two partners, that we get used to a certain speed, a certain pace of interaction between two adults or between an adult and a typically developing child, which often doesn't work for our children with autism. We need to find a different pace, a different rhythm, so that we can synchronize ourselves with them and they can get involved in the fluid back and forth interaction. And when I met Harry, I went into his playroom. He had this beautiful playroom at home with an observation system. They had cameras so that the parents were outside and they could watch what was going on in the playroom. So I went in there to meet Harry. This was the first time that I'd met him. And when I went in there, I saw that he was very engaged in what looked like throwing himself around the room. He was running across the room and he'd hit the wall, and then he'd run back and he'd tumble over the floor, and then he'd run to the window and he'd slap the window with his hands. And he'd run. So he was all over the room, a lot of movement, moving very fast. Harry was about 5 at this time, so he had a lot of energy and he was all over the room. So I walked in the door and it was like he hadn't even noticed that I'd walked in there. He didn't look up at me. I said, "Hi, Harry." Nothing, no response. He just keeps running and tumbling and sliding. He slid across the floor, hit the wall. So I tried kind of the usual things you might try. I said, "Hey Harry, I'm here to play with you. Hey, do you want to come and jump with me on the trampoline?" They had this little trampoline in the corner. So I sort of held out my hands and said, "Harry, come on, let's go." Nothing, no interest. He's still running and sliding and crashing, and he looks like he's completely absorbed in this. So I knew that I wasn't going to get anywhere by trying to get Harry to come and do something different, come and play my game with me. I knew that I had to speak Harry's language. I had to figure out what was going on in Harry's world in order to really make a connection with him and to be able for us to relate together. So I realized the only way to do that was to start moving. So I started to move with him. I started to run around the room and I was trying to kind of understand what he was doing and what was so absorbing about this activity for him. And I remember having this experience of wanting to connect with this little boy, really wanting to relate to Harry and understand who he is and understand his world and be part of that. And if that meant running and falling on the floor and sliding, then okay, that's what I do. So I got into that with him and I started to do it with him. I started to run across the room and I was trying to do what he was doing, and I was banging into the wall and banging into the window and sliding across the floor. But after a couple of minutes of this, I sort of had this sensation that I was doing this on my own. Even though I was doing the same sort of actions that Harry was doing, we weren't doing it together. He wasn't looking at me, he didn't smile at me. It could have been that I wasn't even in the room. There was no connection there. And I was aware that I wasn't quite getting it. Whatever he was doing, I wasn't quite getting the same thing. So although I was trying to follow him and trying to do the same kind of actions that I could see him doing, it felt like there was something missing. We hadn't quite clicked yet. Now I was aware of these video cameras on the wall watching me, And I was aware that his parents were watching this process, and they were expecting me to connect with Harry and to build a relationship with Harry. But he wasn't even looking at me. He wasn't paying any attention to me whatsoever. So I was aware internally for myself of starting to get a little panicked, a little frantic, that I had to get this little boy to connect with me, to play with me. And he just wasn't responding at all. So I tried running faster and louder and banging into the wall harder, see if I could get a response from Harry. Nothing. So 2-3 more minutes went by. And then I realized what I was doing. I realized that in my own anxiety to get a response from Harry, to get him to connect with me, I was trying to force my way into his world, into this experience that he was having. I was trying to push myself in there, and that he hadn't invited me in. So I took a step back. I actually stopped for a moment in the middle of the room while Harry was still flying around the room. And I took a deep breath, and I became aware of what I was doing inside my own head, and that I was using my anxiety about what his parents might think of me as a therapist by not being able to get him to relate to me. So I realized I was doing that, and I decided I needed to drop that, to just completely let that go, because I could see that it was making me become more directive, and that I was trying to basically force Harry. By being such a big presence in the room, I was trying to force him to pay attention to me, and I knew that wasn't going to work. So I took a deep breath, and I sort of said to myself, okay, this is okay. If Harry doesn't want to relate to me, I could spend the whole session in here, the whole hour that I'm supposed to be in here, I could just be in this way with him. I could just run and slide and just enjoy the process of movement. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on movement and how it feels in my body. Because that seems to be what Harry is doing. So I'm just going to go there and do that with him. So I started moving again, but this time with a very different intention. Not with the intention of trying to get him to look at me or trying to grab his attention in some way. But my intention was really just to experience what Harry was experiencing as much as I could. I wanted to feel the floor underneath my feet. I wanted to feel the wall as I jammed my shoulder into it. I wanted to feel the window on my hands. I wanted to just experience what he was experiencing. So I started to do that with him, and actually was moving in a different way and more easily, and I didn't feel like I had to get any kind of interaction from Harry. And as I did that over the next couple of minutes, I started to be aware that there was more to this movement than I had originally figured out, that there was actually this very beautiful rhythm to it. So although Harry's actions were very erratic, so sometimes he'd hit the wall and then the door and then the floor and then the wall and then the door and then the other wall, I couldn't see a pattern in the types of objects that he was hitting or the movement around the room. But what I realized was that there was this rhythm of 4, that he would hit 4 things, boom, 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 and after each 4 beats, there was a pause. And then he'd do 4 more. Boom, 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 pause. Boom, 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 pause. And so the 4 things that he hit were different each time. Sometimes it was wall, 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 wall. Sometimes it was wall, floor, door, wall. So there's all sorts of different combinations. But there was this rhythm that underlaid the entire movement. So all this movement that looked erratic actually had this really beautiful rhythm to it. 4 beats and a pause. 4 beats and a pause. And once I realized that, I just heard it as I was focusing on moving around the room. I just became, and I stopped looking so much at what he was doing, but just enjoying my own experience of moving. That's when I heard the rhythm. And then once I got that, I started to move in the same way. So I very much exaggerated my 4 beats. I'd hit my feet on the floor 4 times, boom, 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 boom. And then I paused. And the first time that I did that, during that pause, just after I'd stopped, little Harry snapped his head around and looked right at me. And then he went off and he did his 4 more beats, and then he paused, and we paused at the same time, and he turned and he looked at me again. And he smiled. It was the first smile I'd seen from him. And then he went off again on his 4 beats and turned to look. And that was how it started. that was how the beginning of me and Harry being able to relate to each other, was me tuning in to his world and what he was experiencing. And he recognized that. He recognized that right away. As soon as I let go of all this stuff in my head and I sunk down into just experiencing his world on a sensory level, he recognized it. And that's when he looked at me and we made contact. And then we went on in that vein for a while, just making the rhythm of 4 and then pause, and we'd look and smile at each other. And then I started to expand it. So when he'd stop and he'd look, then I'd make a funny sound. Or I started to do sound effects in the rhythm of 4 and then a pause. Or I started a little song. I tried different things to see which one Harry responded to the most. And he'd look and he'd smile when he liked something, and then it would grow. So we started getting to a point where during the pause we'd do 1, 2, 3, 4, pause, and I'd make a funny sound and fall over. And he'd laugh. And so we'd do it again. And then the next time I gave him a little gentle push, and he did it. He pretended to fall over. And so we started to take turns. And it became this really beautiful game between the two of us where we were reciprocally interacting. There was a back and forth, an exchange between the two of us that had come from his own interests in that rhythm, that 4 beats and a pause. And that continued to underlie the game as we went through. And we spent the next 35 minutes playing these games that were expanding from this rhythm that he had decided that originally was a very, very inclusive thing for him, that he was just on his own in this rhythm, until I found a way in and I was able to be part of that rhythm with him. And then we were able to open it up and make it something that was reciprocal. It was something that the two of us could relate to each other. So we talked about using a responsive style of interaction, and this is our teaching method that we tend to use at Relate to Autism. It's one of many. We use other approaches and other strategies too, but mostly embodied in the context of a responsive style of interaction. So once we've figured out the teaching method, how we're teaching children, then we need to look at what are we teaching? And the curriculum items are very, very important. So we follow at Relate to Autism, we follow a developmental curriculum. And what this means is that we take the sequence of typical child development as our model. So all children, as they grow and they develop, they do so in a fairly predictable sequence of activities. So if you think about a child who's learning physical skills, is learning, say, to ride a bike, you start by, firstly, this child has to learn from when they're first born to be able to pick their head up off the ground. Then they have to learn to sit up. Then they have to learn to crawl, and then they have to learn to be able to walk and run and balance. All of that has to happen before they're anywhere close to riding a bike. So you wouldn't go in, even if your child was 5, 6, 7 years old and didn't know how to ride a bike, you wouldn't go in and start teaching that child how to ride a bike if he didn't yet already know how to walk. Right? There's certain precursors that we see have to come before certain higher level skills. And so that's essentially a developmental perspective, that there are skills that are more foundational that have to come first. And it's from mastering those skills, from mastering how to crawl, for instance, and to push themselves up with their arms, that infants learn to be able to balance on 2 legs and then walk. So there has to be a certain order in which things are learned. So we take this model as we approach children with autism. And so we see that in social development and communication development and typically developing children, there is a natural order of how things progress. So for a child who isn't yet using words, you don't just start teaching them to use words. You have to go back and look at, well, are the developmental precursors in place? Have they mastered all the steps that would typically come first? So for instance, can this child participate in a back and forth reciprocal exchange with another person? If they can't do that, then working on language, working on using words is going to be very, very challenging. Can this child communicate non-verbally? Can he use gestures, facial expressions? Does he understand when it's his turn in the interaction to make a communication? If he's not doing those things, then again using words is going to be very, very challenging, because for a typical child, all of those things would come first. Now often curricula for autism, certainly older curricula for autism, are based on the idea that somehow there's something fundamentally different about the brain of somebody with autism. And this was really assumed for a long period of time before we had the sort of brain imaging technologies that we now have. It was generally assumed that if we were to be able to look inside the brain of somebody with autism, we would find a different brain. We'd find maybe a piece that was missing or a piece that was out of place, or there'd be something obvious structurally different in this child's brain. Over the last 10 years, we've developed the technology to be able to look inside the brain. And many researchers have looked at the brains of both children and adults with autism, and they haven't found this deficit. They haven't found this fundamental piece of the autistic brain that's somehow different from everybody else's. Now, they've found all sorts of different ways in which the brain functions differently, but structurally, there's no difference. And so a lot of the curricula that we're left with have been based on this idea that there is a fundamental difference or a fundamental deficit in the brains or the neurological structures of children with autism. And so the curricula were developed from this idea that there's something missing, and therefore that these kids aren't going to develop in the same sequence as typical children. And so a lot of the curricula were designed to kind of work around that, to make the best of what we've got and just sort of teach children skills that they might need, skills that would be functional in their lives, without actually following that whole sequence of typical development. So what researchers are now doing is experimenting with, well, if we now see inside the autistic brain and we see that there's nothing missing, there's no fundamental neurological structure that's any different from any other child. So what happens if we teach children in the same sequence, in the same curricula as children who are typically developing? Now obviously if you have a child with autism, then the progress is usually going to be slower. You have to move through that curriculum more slowly than you would with a typical child, especially when it comes to social and communication learning. So you're moving more slowly, and there needs to be more adult support and more input from adults in order to help the child to progress and to develop. But once researchers started to think in these terms and think from this developmental perspective and started experimenting with using a developmental curricula, what they found was that firstly, yes, children can develop in the same sequential steps as typically developing. Children with autism can. Yes, it might take them longer, but it's easier if you have a child with autism and you want to teach them a particular item. It's easier to teach them something that would be developmentally appropriate rather than something that would be age appropriate. So this comes back to a 7-year-old who can't ride a bike, that you need to look at, well, can this child walk and run and crawl and all of those things before you look at riding the bike, even though other 7-year-olds might be riding the bike. Right, so if you have a 7-year-old, say, who's not using words, a developmental perspective would go back and look at the more fundamental developmental skills such as symbolic play and gesture use and joint attention before going on and teaching language. And so what the studies that have started to happen are finding are that yes, you can do this, and it's easier to teach children skills that are developmentally appropriate rather than age appropriate. They've also been able to hone in on a few very specific pivotal skills. So these are skills that when we focus on these skills, so one of them, for instance, is symbolic play. And another one that has been studied a lot is called joint attention. When we focus on these things, then we find that our children become more skilled at symbolic play or joint attention, but that also has an impact on other areas of their development. So for instance, one study found that when we focused on either of those two things, joint attention or symbolic play, it didn't matter which one, then children would become more skilled at the one that was focused on, plus they would start to display more expressive language and use more expressive language, so that there is a wide-ranging impact of focusing on these pivotal skills, because these are developmentally appropriate skills for this child. They're not age appropriate. They're developmentally appropriate. And so when we go back and we follow the typical sequence of normal child development, we start to see that children with autism or PDD or related developmental delays are able to continue their development with less support than you might otherwise think, because they're learning it in the right order, essentially. So at Relate to Autism, we use that approach and we use a developmental perspective. So for every child that we work with, we go right back to the beginning and we start with their ability to engage in reciprocal interaction, and we break that down into a number of sections, and we look at how can the child firstly participate in social interaction as a sort of very basic foundational skill, and then we move our way up the ladder. So only when a child is ready to start using language or verbal sentences, once they've got all the underlying pieces in place, only then do we move on and teach those higher level skills. And what we find is when the foundations are in place, it's much, much easier for children to learn the higher level skills because they have that mastery of the foundational skills to build on.